Hi class, welcome to Illustrator Lab 7. Today we're going to learn a new tool called our pattern brush, and then we're going to review our pattern editor. We're going to do a bunch of work with the pen and width tool, our shape tools, Pathfinder tools, and then our gradient and blending modes. The file you're going to need is called chainsandrainbows.ai. That's in your Google Drive. All right, when you launch that file, it should look like this. We have two artboards, one that contains our artwork for the image that we're going to create, and one that contains some either color swatches or a couple of objects. Now, we're going to create a game that's much like Chutes and Ladders or Snakes and Ladders, if you ever played that as a kid. But instead of ladders that will help you move up spaces, we're going to have rainbows. Instead of snakes or chutes, which would send you down spaces, we're going to have chains. All right, it's going to be sort of space themed. We want it to feel whimsical and silly for the age group of children, and we're going to base that kind of on what's already created here. All right, we have two layers. We have our backdrop layer, which will include the space background, and then we'll create a pattern for it, and then the play spaces, which includes the group of our spaces stars. We have 44 stars and then one moon, so we have 45 spaces in total to play with. And then we'll get started. Okay. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to make it a little bit clearer for our playing audience where they're supposed to go. Now, if you've lived a very long time, you've gotten pretty good at pattern recognizing, in which case you could probably follow the trail of stars pretty accurately and guess where that trail is going to go until you get to the moon. However, since we're designing this for a younger audience, there's a chance that they're not going to understand that these stars are connected in some kind of invisible line, and they'll think they can move from any space they want. So it's our job right now to make this a little bit clearer. We're going to start by creating a path. Let's see, I want you to eyedrop, use your eye key, eyedrop, this purple right here. We're going to use this. And we're going to create a stroked path. I'm going to hit Shift X to change my fill to my stroke. And we're going to start it beyond the corner here, and then make sure that this path flows along the same line as our stars. Now I'm kind of aiming for the middle of the stars as I draw this path, just to make sure that it kind of cuts right in between them all. There's going to be a lot of things that will change about it once it's built, but aiming for the middle will kind of help that next few steps go a little more smoothly. So remember to click long, slow handlebars for those nice graceful turns around our path. And actually I might back up one because I need a little more turn in this next curve. Oops. And then I want you to end it somewhere in the middle of the moon. So we're going to hide this behind everything here shortly. Now I'm going to go back and do a little bit of editing on my path just to make sure it flows really smoothly. If I don't love the corner that I build, I'm going to maybe elongate a handlebar. But take a minute once you've built the path to smooth it out. Maybe if you missed the center of some stars, you can bring in an anchor point and adjust that slowly. By the time you're done, you should have a pretty simple path, not too many anchor points, that goes through our track of stars, our play spaces. Once you have that, let's go ahead and increase the size of this stroked path. Let's start at 50 points. Awesome. And then probably, if you're like me and you had been clicking on the stars and the moon, we've been on the play spaces layer. I want to move this object to the backdrop layer. Now I can do that with the drop-down menu and clicking and dragging everything, but for me what's going to be easier is to hit Command X for cut, and then make sure my backdrop layer is selected on my layers palette and hit Command F for paste in front. And because I have delegated a layer, Illustrator has to put it on the layer that I'm pasting into. Okay, so a 50-point stroke behind this does a really good job of making sure that this path is clear. I think this will be a little bit less confusing for a younger age group if they're going to ever play this game. What I do want to change about it now is I don't want this path to have such a hard edge. I would like it to be a little bit softer. So we're going to do that by selecting our path, and then we're going to come up here and we're going to actually add an effect to it. We're going to come up here to Effect, and here under Illustrator Effects, not Photoshop Effects, under Illustrator Effects, we're going to go to Stylize and Feather. And mine has a default setting to 0.25 inches. Actually, that's almost perfect. I think I'm going to keep it. 0.25 inches. It's going to just soften or feather the edge of that object, which kind of fades it out against the background. I'll hit OK. That way that hard line isn't competing with the nice crisp lines of our landing spaces, but we still have that nice glow of our objects behind it. All right. Next, I want there to be a similar glow behind our moon. In this case, however, I don't need to feather an object. I'm going to use my L ellipse tool, and I'm going to create an ellipse that goes back behind the moon. And instead of it having that colored stroke, let's go ahead and switch that, Shift X, to a colored fill. And then we'll change this to have a radial gradient with 2 purple colored sliders. I'll pull off my red, my black and my white. And I want one of them to be 100% opaque and one of them to be 0% opaque. I'll change my gradient from linear, which is going from my left to my right currently, to radial, so it's going from my center outwards. And then I'm just going to push the center of that radial gradient further out. So if I check that with my gradient tool, you'll see that my center actually starts here right at the edge of the moon. And then it only fades between the moon and the edge of my circle that I drew to hold the gradient. All right, so now we have a glowing path and a glow behind our moon to kind of show us where we're going and why we're headed there. We can probably group those two objects, that path and that moon glow, Command G. And since they're both on the backdrop layer, I think we're just going to leave them there. Yeah, I think that'll be fine. All right, before we get into the rainbows and the chains and that pattern brush tool, I really do want to do a little bit of review with the pattern tool itself. We're going to create a pattern of stars to float in the background here. Now we have 2 colors. We have these 2 colors here. Now if you hold them over your backdrop layer, you'll notice that they are just a little bit brighter than it, even though they're both very dark colors. That's going to be perfect because we don't want them to be nearly as bright as any of the objects that are playable. We want them to stay subtle and in the background. So these are the 2 colors we're going to use. I'm going to hit Command Z to put them back over here. Now what we're going to need is a series of stars and little spots to create a pattern that will go over our background of space. I want them to be stars. I want them to be both 5-pointed stars, like the ones we see out in our spaces, and 4-pointed stars, like the little shines, the little shiny marks. And instead of them staying geometric, like what would happen with a star making tool, I want them to stay very wonky feeling. So they don't have a proper center. None of the edges are matching up correctly or the same sizes. So let's start by, let's eyedrop this shape, or excuse me, this color here. And then I want to build, just by clicking at random, my first star. All right, that went pretty well. I'm going to do a second one. And I'm going to try to make sure whatever kind of silly whimsicalness that I did the first time, I do something slightly different with this one. Maybe I've got one arm that seems stretching outward. All right, one more. Maybe make sure that your little star arms are different lengths or different sizes. Some of them are short, some of them are long. As long as we get 3 different shaped stars that have 5 points on them. All right, next I'm going to need 2 of our 4 pointed stars. So I'm going to go 1. Oops, I don't want any handlebars, so don't drag by accident. 2. And then just to round things out, I want 1 itty bitty little diamond shape. Something that doesn't have any details with it. All right, so I have 3 stars, 2 4-pointed stars, and 1 diamond shape. I want to vary the sizes of these stars. So I'm going to select a few and resize them. Maybe I want like a pretty small one, a medium one, and a large one. And then for my 4-pointed stars, I want one to be medium and one to be small. Okay, so here's my first set of stars we're going to use for a pattern. I want to build a second set. This time I'm just going to duplicate all 6 of those objects, and then I drop that kind of dark maroon, dark mauve color into them. Now this might be enough for a nice variegated pattern, but I'm going to push it a little bit further. I'm going to duplicate both of these sets of objects, and I'm going to mirror them. So I'm going to come over here. Instead of rotate, I'm going to go to my reflect tool. I have programmed a hotkey Shift M for it. You're welcome to if you'd like. And then in the reflect tool, I'm going to reflect all my objects over a vertical axis and hit OK. So now I have a mirror image of each of my objects as well, and I think I'm also going to make them slightly smaller. So no matter what, there are no 2 of the same star because they're either this different size or mirrored. All right, now with all of these created, both sets and both sets of mirrored ones, I want to select all of these and we're going to bring them into our swatches palette to create a pattern. Now remember, if you don't have your swatches palette out currently, you can get that through Window and Swatches. But we're going to click and drag those into our pattern swatch. Go ahead and deselect them once you've done that, otherwise you might accidentally fill them with pattern, which is always kind of a bummer. And then we're going to double click on this pattern to enter our pattern editing tool. Now this one, it's meant to, we're going to try to make this feel random. And so we're going to use the hex by column tile so that our brain can't necessarily anticipate a vertical or horizontal repeat. And I'm going to increase the height of this one. Oops. And the width. You know, let's make these both 2 inches. Go ahead and make this a 2 by 2 inch tile. We want some space in between all these stars. Okay, now your job, they have a 2 by 2 inch hex by column pattern. Let's see, we'll name it star field. Now your job is to spread these objects around in a way that feels randomized. And everybody's is going to be different. I don't want you to try to copy exactly what I'm doing. I think that sounds like a terrible idea. I want yours to be different. I think it'll be far better if we have more variation in everybody's designs. So I want to make sure that we have some of your mauve or purplish stars and your blue stars repeating in areas where they feel mixed up, so you don't have half of them, like maybe the upper half is purple and the bottom half is the blue. So you might need to switch some if you accidentally drag them like I did. Let's see, I've got 3 blues right there. I could probably stand to break that up a little bit. And remember that you can put them crossing through that tile shape. As long as you don't remove them from the tile entirely, they still can repeat if part of them is inside the tile. All right, I'm going to zoom out really quick and see how my star field is looking. That feels pretty good. I don't feel like too many things are repeating very much. I might rotate a few of them in case I feel like I can start to tell that their rotation is similar. I just want to break up any predictability. Maybe I need to resize that one a little bit too. Make sure it is crossing over part. All right, be as picky as you like. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to take a little longer to create this pattern. And then when you're finished, go ahead and hit done. And then we're going to fill an object, a rectangle object, on our backdrop layer. So hit M for rectangle. I'm going to fill that with my star pattern. Now I need to make sure it is behind the track that I created, that glowing track, so I'm going to use my bracket key to move it backwards in the layer. And then I also want to make sure that as lovely as it still is competing a little bit texturally with my foreground. So I'm going to go up to my transparency palette. And again, you can get that through the drop down of window and transparency. I'm going to change the overall opacity to 50%. All right, so now we have texture without competition. Nice, beautiful pattern that's repeating in our background. And we can see it along the edges of our path as it fades. But it doesn't come through that path, so it doesn't interrupt our ability to understand our track. Okay, I think that's all we're going to do to the background, so we can actually lock that backdrop layer. And then let's start to build what we need for our rainbows and chains. So our rainbows, which allow us to skip a bunch of steps, go up in the path, and then our chains, which will drag us down. We're going to use a pattern brush tool in order to achieve this because I want to be able to draw any line. Oops, I'll go to place spaces. I want to be able to draw any line that I want between two spaces, and for that line to appear as a rainbow. All right. Now, if I had to hand build this, I could, but I'd rather not. I'd rather be able to just build one path and just apply that rainbow brush to it. So here we have 5 really bright saturated colors. We're going to create a bar, a rectangle, a long thin rectangle. We're going to start that one off as red. And then we're going to duplicate that one. I want to make sure that there isn't a gap between them, but duplicate it vertically down and make sure this one is orange. I'll do that again for yellow and green and blue. So these are going to be the colors of the rainbow for our pattern brush. Now I want you to zoom in and make sure you don't have any gaps between any of them because that will end up looking kind of a little bit wonky later. In fact, you're welcome to have them overlap a little bit. I think honestly that's probably a little safer than any of them having gaps. You can use a distribute tool if you have them all selected. You could use a horizontal distribute tool maybe if you want them to be equally distributed. But now once we have all those stripes created, I want you to select the group of them. And let's see, depending on the size that you made them, I want you to make them a little bit thinner. So maybe about the size of the chain link here, maybe even a little bit smaller. Now the reason for this is because when we create a pattern brush, the size of the objects that we create it with will be the size of a 1-point stroke. And I don't want it to accidentally be too large and then hard to deal with. So now with those selected, I want you to come up to your control bar, and here where it says basic for your stroke type, your brush type, we're going to use a drop-down menu, and I'll enlarge this really quick. And then we're going to use this plus key. Now, instead of clicking and dragging this into the swatches window like we would if we were making a pattern, we have to hit the plus key instead. And then I want you to select pattern brush, hit OK. We're going to name this rainbow. And in this little editing menu, we can decide a scale, spacing, and then how the corners are treated on a pattern brush, as well as if it's going to stretch to fit a path, or if you'll add space in between segments, etc. Right now, this kind of corner, it's going to look the same way no matter if we choose auto-centered, auto-between, sliced. It will look different if we overlap. I don't want that. Now, we're not going to have any corners on our rainbows because we're going to keep them nice and smooth, so we really honestly won't run into this too often, but it is something that you will run into in the future. Go ahead and create, so your outside corners, which is what this little icon is showing you, go ahead and make sure it is selected, and your inside corners as well. Now, if we needed to add space between, which we don't, but if we needed to add space between something, we could highlight this and increase the amount of gaps between instances of our repeating object. We don't because we actually want it to be connected, but that's just how you add it. And when you're done, let's go ahead and hit OK. And then we're going to create a path. Let's start it on the third star in. So you're going to hit P for path. And then we're going to jump. We're going to click and drag for a nice curved path. We're going to jump this path from here to here. All right, now it's not our rainbow just yet. It's just a fill. This is the last fill that we had selected. So let's go ahead and give this a no fill. And with the object selected with hotkey V, we'll come up here to our brush style types and we will insert the rainbow. All right, so we now have a path with a pattern brush applied to it. We're going to have to change just a couple of things about it so that it does not cover up some of the information behind it. We want all of the pieces of our board to feel playable, not blocked. So let's change this transparency. Go ahead and select your object and go to your transparency palette. From normal to, let's try screen. Screen might work. Overlay doesn't. Let's keep it at screen. Normal to screen. So we see it appearing really nice and bright in the center, and then when it passes over another bright colored object, we still see the edges of that object through it because of a blending mode. All right, so this is a 1-point stroke. I want it to be a little bit wider at the base, so I'm going to use my Shift W, my width tool. And maybe a little wider at this star base, but then thin in the middle to add a kind of stretchy, fun, again, it's that whimsical kind of flavor that we're trying to add to our illustration. All right, now I don't love the way that it just cuts off at a straight edge, but there's really nothing we can do about it, at least on the pattern editing tool, which is why I've decided we're going to add kind of an interesting glowing flare effect, and that can be found right here. This ellipse has a glow. It's still a screen transparency, so it won't block all the information off, but it goes from a, let's go ahead and show you, an opaque white to a transparent blue. All right, we can just duplicate this shape down here, and we're just going to use it to kind of overexpose the area of rainbow that touches the star to kind of just hide that really sharp edge. And then we'll use it, we'll use it a second time over here on this star. Maybe it doesn't need to be quite as large this time, maybe a little bit smaller. All right, so our space is still playable, we still understand it, and we can see through the rainbow to the other spaces that it covered. All right, let's add a few more rainbows in here. I'm actually just going to duplicate this one and then change the location of its anchor points. The next rainbow, I'm going to have it start here on this star, and this will be a short bonus where it'll just jump over 2 spaces. And then we'll keep that rainbow a little bit short so it doesn't interrupt the line above it. I might need to change the width as it touches these stars here. Or I might need to change the handlebars and their angle of approach. But either way, I want you to have a rainbow that goes between these few stars. And then I want you to duplicate that little glow that we're using to kind of blow out the hard edge. And if you need to rotate it, that's totally fine. Perfect, that's 2. We're going to do 3 more sets of rainbows. The next one is going to jump between this star here and this star here. So let's go ahead and duplicate our path and go from this star to this star. Just you wait. It's all bonuses until it's, chains. We'll build chains here in a minute. All right, this one we're going to give like a nice little arc so it feels more fun. We're not going to go just straight across. We want to give it some nice bouncy language. So it is going to pass through a little bit of that other star, but now that we have a blending mode on it, it won't cover it up entirely. All right, we'll duplicate that nice little glow effect. And we'll do our next rainbow. Our next rainbow is going to go from this star here, this really pale one, to this larger one here. So we'll duplicate, holding down our Option key. And we'll give this one a nice big arc too. It's always fun when you're playing games to move a piece really dramatically. And again, we'll duplicate that glow to where the rainbow touches. All right, our last one is going to be between, it's another short bonus, but it's so close to the end that it'll help people feel like they're about to win. So we're going to go from this star to this star. It's literally like a 2-star jump, but that's okay. People will appreciate any bonus they can get. And we want this one to fill up this kind of space next to the moon. Make this feel like really interesting. Really interesting use of space. All right, we'll duplicate the glow. And those are all of the areas where we can get a bonus jump. So if we had rolled a 3 on our first turn, 1, 2, 3, oh my gosh, we just skipped like 18 squares. Fantastic. All right, now for the bummer. Unless it's not your turn. We're going to create the chains. All right. So over here in our little board with our swatches and our stars that we've created, we have our first set of chains. So we're going to use this to create another pattern brush. Now, when we created our first pattern brush using just horizontal bars, the pattern brush is built to repeat whatever you drag into it horizontally forever. So this one had no problem repeating a set of rectangles horizontally and for it to overlap in a way or meet in a way that there was no gap or problem. All right. Now with this chain, if I were to drag this chain, these 2 links in as they are right now, what's going to happen is it's going to match the leftmost side of my first one to the rightmost side of my second one, which means I'm not actually going to get any overlap to show me that the chains are linked. So this is what it will look like. It will repeat like this forever. And that's not what I want. What I want is for the next set to repeat, I'll move that back, in a way that looks like it's overlapped, like they are actually linked. All right, so in order to do that, I'm going to have to get ahead of my tool and I have to anticipate what its move is going to be. I know that I need this part of my link to be behind this part of this bar, this second link that's turned towards us. I'm going to have to cut this bar in half and put the other half over here, knowing that it'll then repeat correctly. And if it doesn't make sense to you now, it will make sense in just a minute. All right, so I'm going to get my pen tool, P, and I'm going to create a straight line right here. Maybe about right there. Almost in the center of my object. It's okay if it's not centered, so long as it's outside of your chain A. So we have a straight line. I want to give it no fill and no stroke. Now with this object selected, I've got a little anchor point over here. There it is, okay. So with this object selected, just this straight line with no fill and no stroke, I'm going to also select my 3 objects that make up this second chain link. So I'm using my group selection tool, Shift A, in order to get those because they're already grouped to my whole chain. Once I just have these parts selected and not the other ones, I'm going to come over here to my Pathfinder tool and I'm going to use a new tool that we haven't really talked about. This one slices a path everywhere that paths touch each other. So I'm using this vertical to cut these 3 objects. Now that they're free of their original shape, I can move them. I'm going to hold down Shift. I can move them until they overlap on the other side of the chain link perfectly horizontally from the original. Now the slicing, if there are 2 paths that are mathematically aligned, we do get some of these funny little like errors, these little hangover shapes. So go ahead and select those and delete them. If you're worried that you have more, go ahead and hit Command Y for outline mode and just select the area and hit delete for any little extra anchor points that might be hanging out. All right, you might need to move this slightly in or slightly out depending on how well centered you grabbed it. But now we have a chain that will repeat horizontally and will overlap each time in a way that looks like a chain link. All right, so we'll delete this copy. And I want you to click and drag on this object. Let's make it a little bit smaller because remember it comes in that whatever size you drag it in equals a 1-point stroke. And we will click our drop-down menu on our control bar for our stroke type, and we're going to add the plus sign, a pattern brush. All right, again, we're not going to have to deal with corners because we're going to make sure that these are nice and loopy. There aren't great corner options here. I think probably the best one is that auto-centered or the auto-sliced. So we can choose them just because they are our best option, but know that we're going to try to avoid turning any corners anyways. And we'll call this pattern chain. All right, we're going to keep this on stretch to fit, which means that if we draw a path that doesn't equal one mathematical unit of these chains that we've already created, it will stretch them until it makes to the end of the path. Instead of adding space, we don't want space added because then we'll get gaps and that doesn't look like a chain. Make sure it is on stretch and then hit OK. All right, now that we've built that path, let's go ahead and decide where our chain spaces are going to be. All right, so I'm going to get my pen tool, P for pen, and I'm going to make a path that goes from this star to this star, kind of like an S curve. So my 2 handlebars are kind of at odds to pull that path into an S. I don't need it to have a fill. Once I have the path built, I'm going to give it the stroke, the pattern brush of the chain. And I can go ahead and connect it. Maybe I just want to connect it in the corner of a star. Not necessarily right in the middle, I don't want to interrupt it. And then I wanted my bright side to be on the top, so I pretended that I was going to continue drawing that path until it flipped. You might need to do the same. Okay, so chain number 1, the bummer space number 1. All right, next, we're going to make the worst possible space that you could possibly draw, and it's going to go from this star here to this star here. So this would be the worst roll you could get, is if you landed on this space and you had to go all the way back to near the beginning. I remember playing Chutes and Ladders as a kid, and I remember that kind of space that happened, and it always happened right before you were about to win. It's the equalizer. I think I might make these chain links a little bit smaller by making them at 0.75 point. Yeah, that's better. And let's see, our next chain space. Let's do one between this star and this star. We're going to avoid crossing too many of our chains and our rainbows just so that we don't create too much visual confusion. We will cross it at least once, but to make a nice clean design, we'll keep them from crossing. Oops, I said 75, not 0.75. Don't do that. And then I'll adjust for those. Anchor points land on the star. Oh no, we could also use our width tool with this if you wanted to give it just a little bit of bounce. So if you wanted to make it thin in the middle, actually I don't think that looks good at all. Don't do that. Bad advice. All right, so we have 5 rainbows, which means to be fair, we're going to build 5 sets of chains. So we've got 2 more sets to build. Let's build one between here and here. It's a nice kind of like peripheral. Now it filled with my gradient because that was the last thing I accidentally selected. And then we'll create another one from this star up into here. So this is where we're going to have a set that crosses. All right, so this rainbow and this chain are going to cross each other. Now it's important every now and again to have one that has an S curve because all of our rainbows are nice, beautiful U curves, just a single like U or a C curve. So when you can get away with a little bit of an S curve, if it doesn't kind of, cut into some space, it'll add some nice little variation. That'll look good in the illustration. All right, that's today's lecture. It's really simple, really fun. I hope you have fun with the pattern brush tool. There's so many things you can do with it. If you wanted to create a series of stars, so our first 2 pattern brushes were just something that had to connect every time. But if you just wanted a trail of happy little stars, let's see, maybe everybody, let's do this last thing before we save our file. Let's go ahead and create a cute, let's see, I'm gonna move all these out of the way. I'm going to create a line but using your wonky little stars from our background. If you were to create a pattern brush using these, you can see how you could get basically a garland of stars instead of something that's connected. And in this case, we would want to add some space because we wouldn't want the side of our diamond to always be touching the side of our star. So we'd add just a little bit of space between each repeat. Which means we could make, oops, I shouldn't have a fill, a garland of stars. Now you could do this with anything. You could do the string of pearls. You could do a line of marching ants. This tool can host stroke. It can host fill. What it can't host is gradient, unfortunately. So we can't have a gradient and then drag it into that pattern brush editor. You can have transparency, so it can be opaque or transparent shapes, but yeah, it just won't handle a gradient very well, and so it'll probably actually just give you an error and tell you to start over. But you can make any stroked path that you like, depending on the needs of your illustration or design. All right, when you're finished with making your little star garland, I want you to make sure that it's on this little artboard somewhere. You can squish it in wherever you like, just so that I can see that you've created it, as well as your cute little sets of stars. And then, yeah, go ahead and double check the placement of all of your chains. I want them all to have the same pattern as this one here. If you need to count stars in order to make sure you get to the right one. you're welcome to just pause the video and then make sure that yours are falling on the same one. And then when you're done, go ahead and turn it in, and I will see you in Illustrator Lab 8. Thanks.